America destroyed its most magnificent train stations on purpose, wrecking ball by wrecking ball. In 1963, New York's Pennsylvania Station, a granite temple modeled on the baths of Caracalla, covering 8 acres, was demolished after just 53 years standing. Across the country, cathedrals of steam were flattened for parking lots and office towers. These were the largest indoor spaces many Americans ever entered. So how did a nation talk itself into smashing its own palaces? The answer begins with the ambition that built them. In the first years of the 20th century, the railroads were the most powerful corporations in the world, and they wanted everyone to feel it. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone employed more than 200,000 people by 1910, making it a workforce larger than the standing army of the United States at the time. To bring its trains into Manhattan, the company had to tunnel beneath the Hudson River, a feat of engineering that cost the lives of several workers and consumed years of labor before a single passenger arrived. Penn Station opened on September the 8th, 1910, designed by the celebrated firm McKim, Mead, and White, with Charles Follen McKim himself driving the vision before his death in 1909. It was not merely a building where trains arrived. It was a declaration carved in stone. That declaration echoed across the country. Grand Central Terminal opened in 1913, its constellation ceiling glowing above the concourse floor, painted with 2,500 stars, 59 of them lit by electric bulbs. The ceiling was famously rendered backwards, the zodiac reversed, and the railroad later joked it was the view God would have from beyond the heavens. In 1907, Washington Union Station had opened its own colossal arches, designed by Daniel Burnham, its main hall stretching 220 feet and once ranked among the largest rooms in the world. 3 temples, 3 cities, 1 message. The railroad was not a service. It was a god, and these were its cathedrals. And like cathedrals, they were built to overwhelm you deliberately. These terminals were overscaled on purpose, not because the crowds needed the room, but because the railroads needed the awe. A traveler stepping inside was meant to feel small, humbled, converted. The buildings were advertisements written in marble, and their message was simple. Trust us. Look at what we can build. Look at how permanent we are. Nowhere was that message louder than inside Penn Station. Its main waiting room rose to a ceiling 150 feet above the floor, a canyon of light and stone where footsteps vanished into echo. The concourse behind it was covered by a vaulted roof of glass and steel, flooding the platforms with daylight so that even the trains seemed to arrive inside a work of art. The whole thing cost around $114 million in 1910, a staggering fortune for the age. To clad it, the railroad quarried some 50,000 tons of pink Milford granite from Massachusetts, and 84 Doric columns marched across its facade along 7th Avenue. And the model was no accident. The architects reached back 2,000 years to the baths of Caracalla in ancient Rome, borrowing the grandeur of an empire to clothe an American railroad. That borrowed grandeur assumed the empire would last forever. It did not. Within a few decades, the permanence these buildings promised began to crumble. Not the stone, but the business underneath it. The railroads had built temples to a future that would never arrive, because Americans were about to fall in love with something else entirely. The peak came, and then the fall came fast. United States rail passenger miles hit their high water mark during the Second World War, reaching nearly 95 billion in 1944, when gasoline was rationed and troop trains crossed the continent day and night. Penn Station alone handled more than 100 million passengers in a single wartime year, its floors packed with soldiers in transit around the clock. It felt like the beginning of a golden century. It was actually the end of one. What killed the golden century was freedom, or at least the American idea of it. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act, authorizing 41,000 miles of new road and committing some $25 billion of federal money, the largest public works project the nation had ever attempted. The concrete poured for decades, and by the 1970s, the network stretched past its original goal. Suddenly, a family did not need a ticket, a timetable, or a station. They needed a car and a full tank, and the open highway belonged to them. Registered automobiles in America climbed from roughly 40 million in 1950 to more than 60 million by the end of that decade, and every one of them was a customer the railroad had lost. The highway had a companion in the sky. Through the late 1950s, commercial jet service expanded rapidly, shrinking the country in a way no locomotive ever could. The Boeing 707 entered scheduled service in 1958, and a coast-to-coast trip that once meant 2 days in a Pullman car became a few hours above the clouds. By 1957, for the first time, more Americans crossed the country by air than by rail. The train, once the fastest thing in America, was now the slow option, and the great terminals began to empty out. Empty terminals are not just sad, they are expensive. As the crowds thinned, the bankrupt railroads made a bitter discovery about their beautiful stations. They were sitting on the most valuable real estate in the city. The buildings that had once symbolized power were now enormous, half-used liabilities occupying land worth a fortune. The math turned merciless. The Pennsylvania Railroad, bleeding money, sold the air rights above Penn Station, the legal right to build in the empty sky over the tracks. The deal, struck in 1962, promised the railroad millions of dollars and a share in the new development, money the failing company could not refuse. Post-war Manhattan land values had soared to dizzying heights, and every square foot of that block screamed to be developed. Meanwhile, heating and maintaining those vast halls cost fortunes every year, warming 150 feet of air for dwindling crowds. A palace had become a millstone. And so the unthinkable was decided. Penn Station was condemned to make way for a new arena and a tower of rentable offices. The building that Americans had walked through in awe for half a century would be sacrificed for something that generated cash. The wrecking crews arrived, and demolition began on October the 28th, 1963. The work would grind on for 3 years. The granite chipped away piece by piece while trains kept running in the tunnels below, passengers stepping through a building being dismantled around them. What rose in its place told you everything about the new priorities. The temple was replaced by Madison Square Garden and the office slab known as 2 Penn Plaza. The arena seated some 20,000 spectators and opened in 1968, a windowless drum of concrete resting where the waiting room had stood. The station itself was not eliminated. It was buried, shoved into the basement beneath the new construction, a warren of low tunnels that finally opened in 1968. The trains still ran. The palace was simply gone, entombed under commerce. Not everyone stood by silently. Architects and critics saw the horror coming and tried to stop it. In 1962, a group of young designers calling themselves AGBANY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, picketed outside the doomed station on August the 2nd, some 200 strong, carrying signs and pleading with a city that did not want to listen. Among them were figures who would shape American design for decades, including the architect Philip Johnson, then in his 50s, marching alongside men half his age. They were principled. They lost. The critics could only mourn in words. The New York Times published an editorial that has haunted preservationists ever since, warning that a society leaves a record of itself, and that we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. The architectural historian Vincent Scully later wrote the line that stuck to the wound. Once you entered the city like a god, and now you scuttle in like a rat. It was a devastating line, and it was correct. But it changed nothing about the fate of the building it described. The ending was crueler than mere demolition. The magnificent granite carved to imitate imperial Rome was hauled away and dumped in the New Jersey Meadowlands, a swampy wasteland across the river. Fragments of the great statues by Adolf Weinman, the stone eagles and the allegorical figures of day and night that had watched over the entrances, were scattered. Some smashed into rubble, a handful rescued and later mounted at other sites. The columns of Caracalla ended up as landfill in a marsh. There is no more brutal image of what America decided its palaces were worth. And Penn Station was only the beginning. What happened in New York was not a tragic accident. It was a template, and city after city followed it. The slaughter of the great terminals spread across the country like a contagion, each one falling for the same reasons that had killed the first. The names read like a funeral roll. Chicago's Grand Central Station, a Romanesque landmark on the south side with a tower rising 247 feet, was demolished in 1971 after its last train departed in 1969. Detroit's Michigan Central Station, an 18-story tower above its concourse designed by the same firms behind Grand Central Terminal, saw its final train leave in January 1988 and was left to rot. Buffalo Central Terminal, an Art Deco masterpiece, opened in 1929 for a city that expected to reach 2 million people, closed in 1979 and stood empty, its 17-story clock tower looming over an emptying city. One by one, the cathedrals of steam went dark. There was a legal reason none could be saved. The law simply did not protect them. When the wreckers came for Penn Station, there was no shield, because the city had nothing to stop them with. The landmarks Americans assumed were somehow permanent were, in fact, legally defenseless private property. The timing was agonizingly close. Penn Station fell before New York City passed its Landmarks Preservation Law in 1965, signed by Mayor Robert Wagner in April of that year, and creating a commission with the power to designate and defend historic buildings. On the national level, the National Historic Preservation Act passed in 1966, establishing the National Register of Historic Places that would eventually list tens of thousands of structures. Both laws were direct responses to the outrage over what had been lost, and both came too late, by a matter of months, to save the building whose death had inspired them. Penn Station died so those laws could be born. But laws are only tested when the next crisis arrives. And the next crisis was already forming a few blocks away at Penn Station's great rival. Grand Central Terminal, the survivor of 1913, was about to become the last stand for American railway architecture. This time, the fight would reach the Supreme Court of the United States. The threat was familiar. Penn Central, the railroad that now controlled Grand Central after the 1968 merger of the Pennsylvania and New York Central lines, wanted to do exactly what had been done downtown: squeeze money out of the sky above the terminal. That merger produced the largest bankruptcy in American history when Penn Central collapsed in 1970, and the desperate company hunted for any asset it could turn into cash. Their plan was to build a 55-story office tower directly on top of the historic building, crushing its grandeur under a wall of glass and steel. The architect Marcel Breuer drew up two versions, one of which would have sheared away the terminal's south facade entirely. It was the Penn Station logic all over again. This time the city fought back with its new law, and the battle became the case of Penn Central Transportation Company against New York City. The railroad argued that landmark status robbed them of their property, that the government had effectively seized their land by forbidding them to build. It was a serious constitutional argument, and the answer would decide the fate of every historic building in America. The fight also gained a face the nation could not ignore. In 1975, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the former First Lady, joined the campaign to save Grand Central. Her presence transformed a legal dispute into a national cause. In January 1975, she boarded a special train dubbed the Landmark Express to Washington with fellow preservationists, drawing cameras that a courtroom brief never could. She wrote letters, she spoke publicly, and she asked a simple question that cut through everything. If we do not stop now, will there be anything left of the past at all? In 1978, the Supreme Court delivered its answer. The court ruled 6-3 in favor of the city, the majority opinion written by Justice William Brennan and handed down on June the 26th. It upheld New York's landmarks preservation law, declaring that a city has the right to protect its historic buildings without paying every owner for the privilege. In a single decision, the justices reversed the exact logic that had doomed Penn Station 15 years earlier. The consequences were enormous. Grand Central survived. More than that, it was restored to its full glory in a project costing some $200 million, its ceiling scrubbed clean of decades of grime and tobacco tar that had darkened the painted stars, its concourse reopening in triumph in 1998. But the decision protected far more than one building. It gave every landmark law in America the legal muscle to actually work. Preservation finally had teeth. With those teeth, the survivors began to be rescued rather than wrecked. Washington Union Station, Burnham's masterpiece, was restored and reopened in 1988 as a functioning terminal and grand public space after a costly rehabilitation that undid a botched 1970s conversion into a visitor center. St. Louis Union Station, once the busiest in the world with as many as 100,000 travelers a day at its peak, found a second life converted into a hotel and shopping mall in 1985, its train shed preserved rather than scrapped. The buildings that survived were now treasures instead of burdens. Passenger rail itself got a lifeline too. In 1971, the federal government created Amtrak to take over the money-losing passenger trains the private railroads no longer wanted to run. On its first day of operation, May the 1st, 1971, Amtrak inherited a shrunken network, cutting the number of intercity routes by more than half overnight. It was an admission that the golden age was over, that the market had abandoned the passenger train, and that only public will could keep it alive. The temples had outlived the empire that built them. Which brings us back to New York and to what the demolition actually bought. The replacement Penn Station, the one buried underground, now serves more than 600,000 riders every day. It is one of the busiest transit hubs in the Western Hemisphere. And it is, by nearly universal agreement, a miserable place to be. Cramped, low-ceilinged, confusing, and grim, it is function stripped of every ounce of grandeur. The contrast is the whole story. Americans traded a building that made you feel like a citizen of an empire for a basement that makes you feel like cargo. In 2021, the city opened Moynihan Train Hall in a nearby old post office, a bright and soaring space offered as partial atonement for what was destroyed. It is genuinely beautiful, but it is an apology, not a resurrection, and everyone who walks through it knows the difference. So we return to the question from the beginning. How did a nation talk itself into smashing its own palaces? The answer is not that Americans were blind to beauty. They saw it clearly. They simply valued other things more. Rail's post-war decline, the soaring value of city land, and the national obsession with highways all combined into a single, ruthless calculation, and beauty lost that calculation every time. The destruction of Penn Station became something larger than a single crime. It became the symbol that gave birth to the entire preservation movement in America. Its loss directly inspired the modern landmark laws that now protect thousands of buildings the country would otherwise have torn down. We had to destroy the greatest one to learn to keep the rest. That is the final verdict on why America demolished its grandest train stations. Palaces sacrificed to profit and progress. The palaces are mostly gone now, but the lesson they left behind still stands guard over everything we have chosen to keep. Every protected landmark in America is, in a quiet way, a monument to the one that was thrown into a New Jersey swamp. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing so you can join us for the next one.